Inside U.S. military command centers, screens lit up with urgent reports from the Middle East. Tensions had escalated rapidly, and intelligence suggested the situation could spiral out of control at any moment. The response from Washington was immediate. An emergency deployment was authorized. 3,000 United States Marines were ordered to move toward the Middle East border region. The decision had been made at the highest levels, and now it moved downward through the chain of command at the speed that only a military machine built and maintained specifically for this kind of moment can move. The message traveled quickly through military networks. Within minutes, bases across the country began activating rapid deployment procedures. Units that had been on standby, some for hours, some for days, suddenly received the signal they had been waiting for. Prepare for movement. There was no ambiguity in the order and no hesitation in the response. On several airfields, the first signs of the operation were already visible before the ink was dry on the deployment authorization. Rows of V-22 Osprey tiltrotor aircraft sat on the flight line with their engines running, the distinctive sound of their twin rotors filling the air across the tarmac. Unlike conventional helicopters, the Osprey can take off vertically and then transition into high-speed airplane flight, allowing Marines to cover long distances faster than any rotary wing aircraft that came before it. The Osprey exists precisely for moments like this one, rapid insertion over distances that would ground a helicopter and at speeds that would leave a conventional transport waiting on a distant runway. Standing beside those aircraft were the Marines themselves. They were already fully equipped and had been for some time. Body armor secured tightly across their chests. Kevlar helmets strapped in place, rifles slung across their shoulders with the practiced ease of people who have worn this equipment so many times that it has become a second skin. Heavy backpacks loaded with ammunition, water, and field supplies for sustained operations without resupply. Many of them had been waiting for this order for hours. Some had been waiting for days, the kind of operational limbo that is its own particular form of stress. Knowing that something is coming, not knowing exactly when the word will arrive. Then finally the command came. Move out. The rear ramps of the Ospreys lowered toward the runway with the hydraulic hiss of a machine designed to absorb exactly this kind of urgency. Marines stepped forward immediately, climbing into the aircraft one by one with the steady flow of a unit that has rehearsed this sequence until it requires no thought. Inside the cargo bay, rows of fold-down seats lined the walls. Each Marine quickly secured their equipment, sat down, and buckled in. Crew chiefs moved down the line performing rapid safety checks, confirming that every person and every piece of gear was properly restrained before the aircraft lifted. The process was fast, disciplined, and precise. Within minutes, every seat was filled. The ramp lifted and sealed shut. Outside, the massive rotors began spinning faster, whipping the air into a violent storm of wind and dust across the tarmac that pushed the ground crews back from the aircraft. Then one by one the Ospreys lifted off, hovering briefly above the runway before the tiltrotor engines rotated forward, transforming the aircraft from helicopter mode into airplane flight. Within seconds, they accelerated and disappeared into the sky, leaving the runway quieter and emptier than it had been minutes before. Their destination was not directly the battlefield. Instead, they were heading toward U.S. military ships already positioned in the region. Those ships would serve as a critical transfer point for the arriving Marines, a bridge between the air movement from the continental United States and the ground operations that might follow. Because while these aircraft were still crossing the sky toward the fleet, another group of Marines was already aboard those vessels, and their preparations had already begun. Below deck inside the ships, officers gathered groups of Marines into tight briefing rooms where the atmosphere was serious and every minute felt consequential. Maps were spread across tables. Mission details were delivered quickly and with the economy of language that combat preparation demands. Rules of engagement, emergency procedures, contingency plans in case the situation escalated further before they reached the ground. The briefings were short and direct. No unnecessary words. No time for anything that did not contribute directly to mission readiness. When the officers finished speaking, the Marines moved immediately back to their assigned stations. That was when the real preparation started. Ammo crates were cracked open, magazines were removed and passed down the line. One by one, Marines began loading rifle rounds into magazines, the sound of metal clicking echoing through the compartment in a rhythm that anyone who has prepared for combat will recognize immediately. Rifles were checked with the careful attention of people who understand that every component needs to function perfectly, and that there will be no opportunity to correct a problem once the ramp drops in a landing zone. Bolts were cycled, optics were adjusted and verified, sidearms were loaded and secured into holsters. Machine gun teams assembled their heavier weapons at nearby positions. Bipods were attached. Belts of ammunition were prepared and inspected. Every man on the ship had something to do, and every man was doing it. Some were loading ammunition. Others were checking radios and communication equipment, running through frequency checks and encryption protocols. Others received final instructions from squad leaders who moved through the compartments with calm urgency. The entire ship felt like a machine that had been switched on and was now running at full power. Because while these Marines were preparing at sea, something important was already happening on the ground. One of the first Marine units had already reached its destination. Their Osprey aircraft descended toward a wide stretch of open desert, the rotors slowing as the aircraft shifted back into helicopter mode for the landing approach. Dust swirled violently across the landing zone in the rotor wash. Then the aircraft touched down. The rear ramp dropped. Marines stepped out quickly, spreading across the terrain with their gear and their weapons, establishing a security perimeter around the landing zone before the dust from the Osprey's departure had fully settled. Their mission was straightforward in its description and demanding in its execution. They had to create a temporary staging base from nothing, a place where every other Marine unit arriving after them could gather, organize, and prepare for operations. The problem was that there was nothing there. No buildings, no tents, no roads, no infrastructure of any kind. Just empty desert stretching in every direction under an unforgiving sun. So the Marines began building from the ground up. Supply crates were unloaded from the aircraft before it lifted off. The first priority was camouflage. Large nets were stretched between poles and stakes driven into the desert floor, breaking up the visual signature of the camp so it would be harder to detect from aerial surveillance. Next came overhead shelters, canvas tarps secured to metal frames to provide shade from the intense desert heat that makes sustained physical work without cover genuinely dangerous within hours. Then the digging started. Marines grabbed shovels and began carving defensive fighting positions into the earth around the perimeter of the camp, the physical work of creating cover and concealment that has defined the first hours of military encampment since long before any of the technology surrounding them existed. Sandbags were filled and stacked. Observation posts were established at intervals around the perimeter. Fields of fire were cleared of any obstruction that might reduce the effectiveness of the positions. Communication specialists assembled portable antennas and began linking the new base into the command network, establishing contact with the naval forces offshore and with the command centers that were tracking the entire operation. Within only a few hours, the empty desert had transformed. What had been bare sand was now a functioning forward operating camp with defensive positions, overhead cover, communications capability, and the beginning of the logistical infrastructure that would support the units arriving after the first wave. It was not finished. It would not be finished for days. But it was functional, and it was growing with every aircraft that landed. Far above the ocean, more Ospreys were already on the way. And thousands of miles away on American air bases, the logistical machine behind the entire deployment had fully awakened. Across multiple bases, enormous transport aircraft lined the runways. Ground crews moved rapidly between them. Forklifts rolled across the tarmac, carrying heavy pallets of military supplies. Cargo loaders lifted massive crates and guided them into the open bays of waiting aircraft. Some of the largest loads being prepared were armored vehicles, driven carefully up the loading ramps by drivers guided by cargo crews who directed them into precise positions before securing the vehicles to the aircraft floor with thick steel chains. Nothing inside the aircraft could shift once it was airborne. The physics of cargo movement in flight are unforgiving, and a vehicle that breaks free from its restraints becomes a catastrophic hazard to everything else in the hold. Behind the vehicles came the ammunition. Crates filled with rifle rounds, mortar shells, grenades, anti-tank missiles, and every other category of ordnance that 3,000 Marines operating in a potentially hostile environment would require. Every box carefully labeled and stacked in precisely calculated positions that balanced the aircraft's weight and center of gravity. Then came the supplies needed to keep Marines alive and effective in the field for sustained operations. Food rations in quantities calculated for weeks rather than days, water containers, medical kits and surgical supplies, fuel bladders and portable generators for power in a location with no infrastructure, spare vehicle parts, communication equipment in multiple redundant configurations. Everything required to sustain a significant force operating far from any fixed base. Aircraft after aircraft was loaded to full capacity, taxied toward the runway, and lifted into the sky on the long journey toward the Middle East. And the moment one aircraft departed, another moved forward to take its place in the loading sequence. The pipeline of supplies had been opened, and it would not close. 24 hours a day, aircraft would continue flying this route, ensuring that when the Marines were in position, everything they needed was either already there or already in the air heading toward them. Back in the desert, the forward operating camp continued to grow with each successive wave of arriving aircraft. Tents appeared across the once empty ground. Vehicles were parked beneath camouflage netting. Defensive positions expanded outward from the original perimeter. Communication antennas multiplied as the base's connectivity to the fleet offshore and to command centers deepened. What had begun as a small staging point established by a single unit with shovels and supply crates was becoming something significantly larger, a launch point capable of supporting a major military operation if the decision was made to execute one. As night fell over the desert, the Marines continued their work without pause. Weapons were inspected. Perimeters were patrolled by pairs of Marines moving quietly along the outer defensive line. Radios crackled with updates from ships offshore and from aircraft arriving overhead in the darkness, their navigation lights the only indication of the sustained flow of men and material still coming in. Some Marines rested briefly against their gear, taking the few minutes available before the next task arrived. Others stood watch at the outer positions, scanning the dark horizon with the focused attention of people who understand that the landscape beyond their perimeter is unknown, and that unknown in this context means potentially dangerous, because everyone in that camp understood the same thing. This buildup was not a precaution. It was not a demonstration. It was a deployment with a purpose. Thousands of Marines were now moving into position. Aircraft were arriving with supplies around the clock. Ships at sea were filled with combat-ready units preparing to move to the ground. The entire system, from the air bases in the continental United States to the ships offshore to the camps spreading across the desert floor, was now connected into a single operational network, and it was all oriented toward the same possibility. If the order came, these Marines would already be exactly where they needed to be, ready to move, ready to fight, and ready to change the course of whatever came next across the Middle East.